Right, thank you very much for having me. I'm Mitch Hunter-Scullion, CEO and founder of the Asteroid Mining Corporation. And basically, asteroid mining is my passion, my hobby, and my profession. So I'm very, very pleased to be at another of the Golden Triangle universities. There's only a few more I have to give lectures at, and I think I've conquered them all. And then we go into the asteroids. So, asteroid mining. I would like to pose an argument that asteroid mining is the single greatest economic opportunity in human history. There's a question mark there, as you'll see in a minute. So the reason for this is obviously quite simple. Our planet is inherently limited. I mean, Earth is big, no one's disputing that, but the Earth is only so big, and essentially there are limits to growth. So I would like to talk briefly about this little man here. This is Malthus and Malthusian theory, which if you studied economics, you'll probably know all about. Essentially, under the Malthusian growth model, you can only go so far before essentially you reach what's known as a Malthusian catastrophe, where essentially the human population overruns the demand for, well, Malthus was talking about food production and the idea that there was only so much space for growing crops. A kind of more up-to-date model of this would be there is only so many metals on Earth, and especially when it comes to things like platinum group metals, we are rapidly approaching a period where platinum group metals are becoming more and more scarce. It's becoming more expensive to mine them, and it's becoming more difficult and environmentally challenging to even access these metals. So we are reaching a Malthusian catastrophe on Earth with regards to metal production. I mean, they're called precious metal for a reason, because they are scarce and difficult to get. However, that is not the case universally. As soon as you leave our planet and head out into the solar system, things which are incredibly scarce on Earth become relatively abundant. Platinum being my favourite of all the metals here, because it's shiny and everybody likes shiny things. But more than that, platinum is an incredibly useful element. So for example, the laptop that I'm speaking to you through right now has probably a little trace amounts of platinum in it. 25% of the global annual platinum supply goes into smartphones. So the technology which underpins our entire society is essentially dependent on platinum group metals. And we only mine, what, 195, 200 tons of them every year from an entire planet, whereas a single 1 kilometre diameter metallic asteroid of an upper 90th percentile platinum bearing composition, that's the jargon for you, would contain 117,000 tons of platinum. And just to put that into perspective, at current market prices, that's probably about £2.35 trillion worth of platinum, which in sort of slightly more perspective is roughly equivalent to the gross domestic product of the United Kingdom. And that's platinum alone. It's not including palladium, iridium, or any of the other sort of platinum group metals, or even gold. It's gold in asteroids. Everybody likes gold, it's shiny, it's yellow, everybody likes gold. That's in asteroids as well. So we're at a new point in history where essentially we have the choice to stay on this planet and to exploit the Antarctic, the Arctic, and look for more of these resources, or we can look outwards, we can look upwards, and we can say, well, what does the solar system hold? Where is it? What's it worth? How can we get it? And that's essentially kind of what we do at Asteroid Mining Corporation. We are looking for those asteroids which are valuable, and ultimately we're putting together a plan of action so that we can ultimately recover materials from these asteroids and bring it back to Earth and put it up for sale. So this is one of my main points, and I hope you take this away from today, that perpetual economic growth is impossible on a spherical Earth. We are limited on this planet. We're inherently limited. This is a lovely picture from Apollo 8, where you can see the Earth from, I think this is about 10, 15 kilometers above the moon. So you can see the moon, you can see kind of the lovely lunar landscape, and then you can see the Earth. So that's 250,000 miles of a distance between the lunar landscape at the bottom and the moon in front, or the Earth in front of you, which comparatively speaking is nothing. The moon is very, very close in terms of system, but the hardest part of getting to anywhere in the solar system is getting out of the Earth's gravity well. As soon as you've left the Earth's gravity well, you're essentially halfway to anywhere in the solar system. So as it becomes more and more economically viable to look for resources in space, and it becomes more and more economically viable to send things up into space, thanks to sort of SpaceX and other launch providers who are massively bringing down the cost of access to space. We're now at a point where we can essentially start looking in space for our resources, and this is a very exciting time in human history because of that, because we are potentially on the verge of radically altering our economic system by opening up the Earth to space resources. And the reason why we do that is quite simple. If you look at this lovely and slightly tetchy diagram on the right there, and this is essentially the Earth's crust and sort of a kind of slice from the ground to the core, as it were. We can only mine down a mile, 2 miles. Capabilities for mining on this planet are quite limited. I mean, the deepest holes that we've ever mined, I think that one in Siberia, goes down about 12 kilometers, and then essentially it starts to turn to, magma, and it becomes very difficult to go any further. It is harder to go 100 miles down on this planet than it is to go 100 million miles out and beyond of this planet. So it would make more sense for us to look in space than to start drilling deeper and deeper. And the problem with platinum group metals is that we have to drill deeper. They're very difficult materials to find. Platinum group metals in particular are predominantly found in asteroid impact sites. So if you're looking for the distribution of platinum mines, predominantly they would fall either within very deep mines or they would fall within impact craters. So it kind of gives you an idea that platinum has been predominantly seeded onto our planet by asteroidal impacts. And if that is the case, then the main amount of platinum on our planet is unfortunately beyond our reach. It's a very dense, it's a very heavy element, and during the early formation of the solar system, the early planetary formation of Earth, platinum group metals essentially sunk deep into the crust, towards the mantle and even further into the core of our planet. So it's impossible to reach. There is lots of it, don't get me wrong, but we can't reach it. And even with, the most money, like if you had a blank check, you still couldn't reach the amount of platinum that we can find in space. So Earth is quite limited, but space is not. So let me just put that into context somewhat. This is a very famous photograph. This is the pale blue dot. I believe it's Carl Sagan's favourite photograph because it was taken by Voyager 1 at a distance of 6 billion kilometres from the sun. Earth, as you can see, is that tiny little blue dot in the middle there, and it's tiny. You can barely notice it. If you didn't know what it was, you wouldn't even recognise it. But that is us. That is the Earth. That is the moon. That is everywhere that humanity has ever been, and for the foreseeable future will ever go. So that is a very small amount of space when you think of the size and density of the solar system. So it's important to kind of take a step out. We have a very geocentric view of the solar system, or a geocentric view of the universe even, and that we like to think that Earth is, the centre of everything. I think it's a human condition to do so, but the Earth is not. The Earth is the further up from the sun. We're not particularly special. We're just, special in the way that we can sustain life, and we have a biosphere which can sustain life and can sustain human condition. But it's not the be all and end all when it comes to resources. There are many, many, many more resources in our solar system that are on Earth. And I think that is the first major point to take from this lecture, is that essentially we're very small, we're very insignificant, and even solar system scales. When you're talking about cosmic scales, we are nothing. We're a grain of sand. Even within our own solar system, we're essentially a grain of sand. So there's a lot of expansion that we can do, and that means that there's a lot of economic growth that we can do as part of that. So this is one of my main points, and this is one of my main kind of catchphrases, is that the Earth's resources are finite and that society's demand for these resources are infinite. Space resources will allow for centuries, if not millennia, of economic growth. And the importance of this is it's sustainable economic growth. It's not just sustainable economically and financially, it's sustainable from an environmental perspective because it also allows us to, not destroy our planet. And I'm sure you'd all agree with me, but that is one of the things which we should be focusing on as we go forward into this decade and beyond. We are all, predominantly in our 20s. We're all in a position where we will be deciding and dictating what the future looks like. And I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that the future is brighter and greener and more sustainable. And to use a quite terrible pun, the sky is not the limit. So let me break down asteroids for you and give you a little bit of an idea about what they look like. There are 1.5 million asteroids that we know of with a diameter of 1 kilometre and above. As you can see on the left, they are predominantly to be found within the asteroid belt, so sitting between Mars and Jupiter. There are also some sort of within this sort of Jovian orbit, which are the Trojans and the Greeks, and the Hildas could possibly be described as that as well. Essentially, these are the kind of the further out asteroids. These are the ones which, from an economic perspective, aren't particularly interesting because it takes too long to get there. It takes multiple years to get to Jupiter. Even some of the closer in ones in the main belt, they are not particularly interesting because there's a lot more of them, but they are very, very far away. To travel a couple of 100 million kilometers takes quite a long time, and we don't have that long. Like, human lifespans are limited to 70, 100 years max. If you're waiting for a 15, 20 year mission in order to turn a profit, then your business is not sustainable. However, on the right, as you can see in this lovely flashy diagram, which we will thank Peter Schurerik for, is the near asteroids, and these are the ones which are particularly accessible. Essentially, they're very interesting from an economic perspective because they are close, they're accessible. They are predominantly within the Earth orbit, within the Martian orbit. They're close, and we can get to them, and we can essentially realise our potential economic opportunities within them. And there are 18,000 near-Earth asteroids. But that is not to say that 18,000 of these asteroids are, mineable, because they're not. The vast majority of these asteroids are of, no real interest to us. And that really comes down to composition. So the composition, there are three main classifications of asteroids. You've got your C-type, which are carbonaceous asteroids, which, will contain water, but water is not the golden goose, as it were, of space resources. And I think this is one of the main differentials between Asteroid Mining Corporation and some of our competitors, is that we don't really see water as being the justification economically for space mining. Water is great, and as soon as you start to leave our planet and go elsewhere, water becomes an incredibly desirable and valuable commodity. But water is just water. You would never bring it back to Earth. You're never going to turn a profit. The most of a market you can have for water is the moon, whereas there's already water, so not really going to do that either. Or you could sell it to the space station, but it's not really economically justifiable to do that. And I think that's one of the main business model failures that the space resources industry has failed from in the past. So to give a kind of an idea of the classifications of asteroids beyond that, you've got silicaceous asteroids, which are sort of your S-types. These are, again, one of the main sort of populations of asteroids. Predominantly silicaceous and carbonaceous asteroids make up about 96% of asteroids. However, off those silicaceous asteroids, again, you'll see water used in the form of hydroxyl and hydrated clays. But again, water is not that useful, or it's not economically justifiable. It's very useful, but it's not economically justifiable to go purely for water. If you want water, get it from Earth or go to the moon. It's cheaper, makes more sense. Until we have, a population of 10,000 in the moon, it's probably not going to be economically justifiable to put water from asteroids on the moon. It's never going to be economically justifiable to bring water from asteroids to the Earth, unless you really marketed it as a niche product and sort of it was asteroid water became the new champagne. But I highly doubt that's going to happen. But it's at 4% of asteroids are not silicaceous or carbonaceous. It's that 4% of asteroids which are metallic M-type asteroids, which we are particularly interested in. And of that 4% population of sort of total asteroids, we can reasonably expect about a quarter, so about 1% of all asteroids and the near-Earth asteroids to be platinum bearing, sort of economically justifiable asteroids to mine. So current models suggest that it would be about 180 to 200-ish asteroids, which would be potentially viable candidates for mining. However, that's not taking into account their orbit, their spin rotation. It's not taking into account sort of how long it takes to get there. It's just based on composition. So what we are essentially doing at Asteroid Mining Corporation is developing algorithms and developing the Asteroid Prospecting Satellite 1 in order to identify which of these asteroids are both accessible and, economically viable to go and look at. So let me just give you a quick economic analysis of asteroid compositions and enjoy some lovely pictures of asteroids as I do it. So here is a breakdown of a single 1 kilometer diameter upper 90th percentile platinum bearing metallic asteroid. As you can see on the left, it contains in fact, all the platinum group metals. You've got palladium, platinum, iridium, rhodium, osmium, and ruthenium, as well as a little bit of gold. Looking at the annual global production, we'll use platinum as an example. So I think this table is about 3 years old now. So in 2017, we mined 196 tons of platinum as a planet. And at a total sort of value of 20 million pounds approximately per ton. That gives a total market value for platinum Earth at about £4 billion per year. So bearing in mind this is a very small and comparatively insignificant asteroid compared to some of them. Within that 1 kilometer diameter upper 90th percentile metallic asteroid, there is 117,000 tons of platinum, which gives an embedded value at £2.355 trillion, which is essentially the gross domestic product of the UK and platinum group metals alone. If you'd like to look at palladium, it's another perfect example. Again, roughly 200 tons of annual global production. Palladium is considerably more expensive than platinum due to its industrial uses, but the market value for palladium is currently about £7.75 billion. Again, there is 67,000 tons of palladium within that one small asteroid, which gives an approximate embedded value of about £2.45 trillion. Obviously, this does not take into account the price depreciation from releasing platinum into the market, because that you're never going to be able to release, 117,000 tons of platinum into the market. It's just not technically feasible to do so. However, it does show that there are massive quantities of materials which are, utterly desirable for economic survival, can be found within asteroids and can be found within a single asteroid. So if you're to put the infrastructure in place to mine asteroids, then essentially you could potentially fill our platinum group metals requirements for the next 100, 200 years. And technically we're probably only going to be able to bring back 20 tons at a time at most, maybe 30. So we're never going to be able to bring back huge amounts of platinum, where it's only going to be a supplementary to the Earth market, as it were. But there will come a point where essentially we get to a stage where we can start supplementing Earth-based production and terrestrial production with space resources, and then there will become a point where essentially it becomes cheaper to do so and to mine these metals in space than to mine them on Earth. And I think that the environmental protection aspect of that will become more and more important as this decade and the next decades go through. So just to give you kind of an idea, gold is another perfect example here. We mined what 3,150 tons of gold in what 2017, whereas the total market value for gold was 104 billion pounds essentially. But there is what 2,400 tons of gold within that single asteroid. So again, almost equivalent, or at least what 2/3 equivalent to the Earth-based production, or 3/4 equivalent to the Earth-based production of gold to be found within a single small asteroid. And again, that is still what 80 billion pounds just in gold alone. So if you hold, precious metal shares, I would probably like reinvest them into Bitcoin or something, because it's probably more sustainable in the longer term. So here is a picture of an asteroid up close, as you can see on the left. This is the Hayabusa 2 probe, and this is at Asteroid Ryugu. And as you can see, that little shadow is the Hayabusa 2 probe. So we can visit asteroids. Technically, it's perfectly feasible to rendezvous with asteroids. It's demonstrably feasible. We've done it already. It's happened. So we know that we can do this. The question now is, can we do it at an economically justifiable level? And again, here's another excellent picture from that same mission. This is the surface of Asteroid Ryugu. As you can see, it's just a rock. Like, asteroids are very exotic things which are quite hard to conceptualize, but essentially they are just rocks in space. They contain the same things which are on Earth, but with the benefit of having the heavy, dense metals and materials which sink into the crust of the Earth on the surface, which makes it much more accessible and much more economically viable to go and essentially examine and explore and extract in the longer term. This was a video, but I don't think it will work, so I'm just going to skip it. Or it might work, it might take a minute. But yeah, this is from the Hayabusa 2 probe, and this is it landing on an asteroid. This might take a minute to load, but essentially this is the second touchdown for Hayabusa 2. And as you will see, if it ever loads, it might take up to a minute. Essentially, we have already landed on asteroids. We've already, touched them, sampled them, been there, done that, got a t-shirt, as it were. So we know that we're capable of doing this. We know that we're capable of going and recovering material from asteroids. In fact, the material from this asteroid is now back in Japan and is currently being studied as we speak. So it's probably the most expensive, 5-10 grams of material that's ever been found, but that's the nature of space at the minute. But as you can see, in order to sample an asteroid, you come down quite slowly. This is sped up quite fast. And essentially, this is, I believe, a carbonaceous asteroid. So essentially, you've got a different profile to what you'd find in a metallic asteroid. It's much more rocky and it's much more kind of porous, as it were. It's much more like a rubble pile, essentially, of material that is held together by a very weak gravity force. But in doing so, you can essentially go and you can sort of examine the material from there. And also, we are now sort of legally in a very interesting position in our industry, in that the UK, Japan, Australia, the United Arab Emirates, Italy, and several other countries where I may have forgotten, have essentially signed the Artemis Accords, which were sort of proposed by the United States and NASA. So they are basically legal framework for space utilization, and essentially demonstrates that this can and will be conducted under the auspices of the Outer Space Treaty. So we are not breaking any international law by going and recovering material from space, which is good because I don't want to end up in The Hague. It's not really sort of my plan to end up in front of the International Court of Justice. But now that we have this in place, we have the legal surety that our industry is regulated, and that's a really, really good and comforting thing, because I've always been sort of worried about a knock on the door from an anonymous civil servant for the past few years, saying what you're doing is illegal, you're operating in a grey legal area, which is why we have proposed a UK Space Resources Activities Bill, which will essentially regulate and ultimately sort of codify what needs to be done for our industry to get to maturity. So how do we get to maturity is the next question. As you can see, this is probably slightly old, but this was Trump who signed that. Essentially, the US is leading this and Luxembourg is leading this internationally, but there is now essentially recognition that you can have not property rights, but priority rights in space. And that's an important distinction that we can come back to in a minute. And also there has been the Hague International Space Resources Governance Working Group, building blocks for the development of an international framework on space resource activities. I was very fortunate to be a member of this organisation and to contribute to these discussions. And I'm very pleased to see that the Hague building blocks are essentially being adopted into the international system. So now that we know that asteroid mining is legal, how do we go about, actually doing it? The difficult bit. So that's where we come in, and we've been doing this for almost 5 years now. In fact, it's about 5 years in March 25th. So we'll probably have a small celebration for that. But yeah, what we like to see at Asteroid Mining Corporation is imagine a future where we can use the resources of the many worlds beyond Earth and then work as if you live in the first days of a better world. That's what we do, and that's what we're quite pleased to do and proud to do. So the first problem with asteroid mining is that we know where the asteroids are, but the vast majority of these asteroids have no spectral classification, so we have no compositional data on the overwhelming majority of asteroids. It's very difficult to justify a $100 to $200 million mission to an asteroid if you don't actually know what it's made of. So that essentially forces us to go and categorize and catalog these asteroids. And doing so, we can essentially turn around and say which asteroids are economically viable to mine, which is beneficial for us. But also by doing so, it means that sort of the scientific community gets a much deeper understanding of the nature of the early formation of the solar system and the distribution of particular sort of asteroid classifications. The problem with doing this on Earth is quite simple. It's expensive. We've been quoted £10,000 a night to use a 2-metre diameter telescope, which is quite steep. And also beyond that, it says a million plus there. You're probably talking more in the realms of 5, 10, 15, 20 million in order to build a telescope which is capable of doing this kind of classification. And even if you were to spend all that money, you can only really operate for 8 hours a day, 12 hours a day. We are very limited in the fact that when you're on a planet, you can only point at the sky, you can only point at one bit of sky, and it's quite dark at times, which is great, but then you have daylight coming through, and yeah, like you can't observe asteroids in the daylight, the sun blocks everything out, so essentially you have wasted time on a constant basis. However, the solution to this is to use a satellite, which we have designed. This is the Asteroid Prospecting Satellite 1. And essentially, by using a satellite in a well-selected orbit, you can essentially have the sun behind you on a 24/7 basis. So you can essentially point out into the solar system and look at these asteroids on a constant basis. So you can have a 24/7 observation schedule, which brings the cost per asteroid down quite significantly. And beyond that, you can also essentially have a much deeper understanding of the asteroids for probably an equivalent, if not cheaper, costs. We're at a strange point in sort of the history of the space industry where it's actually becoming cheaper to build satellites and to build telescopes, and that's again quite a novel sort of a novel use of technology. But we believe that we can bring the cost of an asteroid spectre down from about £666,000 or £6,666 to £433 per asteroid, which is a significant saving in an order of magnitude. And in doing so, we can essentially sort of have a much deeper understanding of the resources in our solar system, because at the minute we have only sort of spectrally classified 1,500 asteroids in our solar system. The University of the Canary Islands did a study where they classified about 100 or 120 asteroids, and it costs them about €1 million to do so. Whereas we reasonably expect to be able to categorise and classify 9,000 asteroids per year, which is more than has ever been done, and ultimately will massively contribute to the scientific knowledge of asteroids. So beyond this, how do we go about sort of, once we've found these asteroids, once we know what they're made of, what do we do? Do we, sort of sell up, or do we actually go there? And I think ultimately the next step, once you actually know which asteroid is the one you want to go to, is to go there and to sort of sit down, look at it, do what the Japanese Space Agency have done and sample it. And essentially what we're doing here is that we are developing a CubeSat that will look at these asteroids, but then beyond that, what we like to call Project Direxia, we will go to the asteroid and we will essentially sample it. We'll ground proof our spectral readings through remote sensing, and then essentially once we have ground proofed the resource capabilities of that asteroid, then we can look to identify what that's worth, and then we can essentially start to justify going the cost of going and starting to recover material from it as well. Until you get there, until you actually have a robot on the surface which is digging and proving, you're never going to get anywhere. So once we get to that point, then we're in a good position. Here's another video, which I was, if it works, there we go, internet's been fast today. This is just a kind of a quick video to show you what the asteroid prospecting satellite one looks like, and essentially what it does. Very stylized. So there's the asteroid prospecting satellite one there, and essentially there's your asteroid. Definitely not to scale, because if an asteroid that big was coming towards us, then you would be worried. Yeah, that's not not to scale, but that's fine. For demonstration purposes, this is the asteroid prospecting satellite one looking at the asteroid, analysing the spectra and identifying platinum. Winner, winner, chicken dinner, we're all minted. So here is what asteroid mining would look like. Again, this might take a minute to load, and I'm aware that we're sort of about done, so I will move on to questions in a minute. But yeah, asteroid mining will essentially, an asteroid mining mission will be launched from Earth. It'll be sort of a small probe. It will leave the Earth, it will go out into the solar system towards the near Earth asteroids. It will rendezvous with an asteroid, and once it finds its asteroid, it shall get into its orbit. It shall essentially slow down in its orbit. It shall match speeds when it's rendezvoused. Its orbital velocities will be the same, and essentially it will land on the asteroid, attach itself to the asteroid, and then commence drilling. As you can see there, it's put itself onto the asteroid. It's moving and allowing itself to sort of position itself for drilling. And there goes the drill into the surface, and yeah, it drills up the material, and that goes into a containment unit. The containment unit takes off. We leave the infrastructure in place so that we don't need to spend that money twice. We can then just send a smaller spacecraft in order to reuse the same equipment. This containment unit then jettisons from its main spacecraft hub, comes into the Earth, deorbits, and again, we are minted. Everybody's a winner. So this is just to give you an idea of any of your future academics. Within the next 3 years or so, we should have the Space Resources database online. It will be essentially, our plan is for it to be the one-stop shop for asteroid compositional data, asteroid economic modelling data, and essentially asteroid legal registrations and claims and things like that. Any information that you need to know about a particular asteroid will be within the Space Resources database, and it will be sort of heavily discounted for academic customers as well. This is just a kind of a brief rough down on what we're doing, but yeah, so database of asteroids, movement schedule, identifying judicious orbits, and also things like the data on asteroid material composition. There's multiple sort of client bases for this, and yeah, that's me. Imagine your future and then build it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the talk. Yeah, so now we're going to open up to some questions. If you've got any questions, then either message me the question, I can read it out if you're a bit shy, or you can try and raise your hand, and then that is, yeah, I'll try and let you unmute. As a starter, I've got a question actually. So, why has Deep Space Industries and Planetary Resources failed, and why will you succeed? Because as far as I know, Planetary Resources also wanted to mine platinum-based metals, and they also wanted to start with asteroid tracking operations.
That's quite an easy one. Profitability. So it's a two-pronged answer. So we'll start with profitability first. Essentially, we have a different business model, in that we are essentially focusing on the robotic development for the next 3 years. So we are very fortunate to have a partnership with Tohoku University and the Space Robotics Lab in Sendai, Japan. And as part of that, we are developing the space-capable asteroid robotic explorers, scary space robots, as it were. With our scary space robots, which, if you haven't noticed, is a bit of a nod to WALL-E, if any of you have seen that. But with our scary space robots, we have terrestrial applications, so things like industrial inspection, nuclear inspection, etc., etc. But by using space technology to sort of solve a problem on Earth, you essentially position yourself to have a platform of organic capital growth, and that baseline platform of profitability is ultimately vital if you're going to go and, pay the bills. If you can't pay the bills, you go bankrupt. That's the first and most important lesson in business, and it's a lesson in every business. It doesn't matter if you're in space resources or if you're a baker. If you can't pay your bills, then the bailiffs are going to come to your door. So the reason why I believe that Planetary Resources failed is that they were essentially expecting to be incredibly well funded for a long time. They were very fortunate to have some very high profile investors and backers from quite an early stage. And I think that Planetary Resources done amazing work in laying the foundations for the space resources industry. In fact, Deep Space Industries and Planetary Resources were two companies which I wanted to work for when I set up Asteroid Mining Corporation. And one of the reasons why I set up Asteroid Mining Corporation is because with an international relations degree, I didn't feel qualified to work for them. So I thought that I would set up my own British alternative and see how we go on. But yeah, the other reason why I feel like Deep Space Industries in particular may have failed is due to the business model. Again, profitability is key and, the most crucial aspect of any business. But beyond that, when you get to justifying the cost and the time and the expense and the human capital that it costs in order to develop a space resources capability, there has to be a market for what you're selling. You can't go out into space to bring back something we have on Earth. So going out into space to, recover vast amounts of platinum, yeah, that works because platinum's there and scarce on Earth, and we use it. It's very economically worthwhile to go and do that. Going out into space to recover water, it's not quite as easy. And, with sort of water production in space, it's great for the space station. It's great for, the lunar outpost and things like that, the lunar gateway. But yeah, it's not really going to pay the bills, as it were. This is a very expensive industry to get into, and you need some way of paying the bills. So that's why we've essentially developed our robotics capability and are developing a robotics capability so that we can essentially pay our way into space rather than being dependent on other people's money.
All right, thank you for the question. The person put their hand up was Max.
Hello, thank you for the talk. Very interesting. I guess my question is quite blunt, really, and it essentially boils down to sort of how realistic you feel your timeline is, especially when compared to the sort of length that sort of established agencies have gone through for sort of Hayabusa 2 and for OSIRIS-REx, only to return with what is quite a small mass. So sort of how do you feel your plans line up with that, especially given sort of the very ambitious goal of sort of eventually reaching sort of tons of retrieval?
Well, I think that sort of agency level missions are very different beasts from commercial missions. By virtue of a commercial mission, the goal is to make money. The goal is to sort of essentially generate profit. So we have a kind of a different game to play, as it were, and that we need to bring the costs down and bring the revenues up. So Hayabusa 1 was launched in what, 2004, I believe. I was 9 years old. Didn't even know what space was at that point. I think I had a space shuttle model back then. And that was my only kind of introduction to space. Beyond that, Hayabusa 2 was launched in 2014, and I remember watching the launch and sort of suddenly getting interested in sort of space and the potential of asteroids. But again, it's a scientific mission, and it's to a non-metallic asteroid. So it's for essentially metallic asteroids are the ones which we're interested in. We're not going to an asteroid to sort of just go there, touch it, flags and footprints, kind of Apollo style. We're going to an asteroid to lay the foundations of an infrastructure which will last for decades, if not more. We're going to the asteroids in order to put up processing facilities. We're going to the asteroids to put up drilling rigs. That's a much longer term goal. So with sort of the Asteroid Exploration Probe 1, for example, we're essentially going to an asteroid to touch it, explore it, see the resources, maybe take a small sample in a kind of Hayabusa 2 level mission, and then potentially bring that back and do some sort of ground-based analysis. But with that analysis, we'll go back to that same asteroid, and then essentially by having done that ground proofing, we would look to essentially use that as the economic justification for establishing an infrastructure. And once the infrastructure is in place, then it does become possible to do much larger the turns. And obviously, we're probably looking at what, somewhere between 2030, 2035 before we get to an asteroid with, you know, a drilling rig and start, you know, digging down and starting to bring things back. Optimistically, I'd say 2030, sort of realistically, I'd say 2035, pessimistically, I'd say 2040. We work in a 15-year business plan. It's not a quick industry, but by establishing an infrastructure, it's about essentially creating the ecosystem for multiple tips, and part of that is launch providers. So, you know, SpaceX's Starship would be a perfect example of that. The capability to bring 30 tons to a deep space destination means that we can start planning for a 30-ton payload to an asteroid. And conveniently enough, our processing plant at present looks to be about 30 tons. So, you know, it's not going to be a cheap enterprise, but it's eminently possible in the long term.
Hello. Yeah, I had a question. I don't know if you already answered it, but I just wanted to know, before you start the exploitation and actually bring things back on Earth and selling them, where does your money come from? Who's investing in it? Are you going to have any kind of revenues before this?
Yeah, so essentially the goal, and I think one of the differentials of Asteroid Mining Corporation to our competitors, is that we essentially are looking to self-fund as far as possible. Obviously, that's not totally possible for some things, but essentially with the space capable asteroid robotic explorers in our sort of robotics program, we're essentially using that to fund the asteroid prospecting satellite 1 development, and then as the revenues grow for the space capable asteroid robotic explorers, then we would look to reinvest a lot of that into the asteroid exploration probe. With the asteroid exploration probe as well, essentially by going to an asteroid and having something on an asteroid, then essentially you will have the exploration license, which it looks to be convertible in the longer term to an exploitation license and an extraction license. So by essentially sending something to an asteroid, you will have the right to recover material from it as well, which in itself is very valuable, especially when some of these objects can be worth what, 9, 10 trillion. So yeah, we kind of follow that model. For what, a £175 million mission, we will essentially be able to have, you know, de facto property rights or de facto priority rights over an asteroid worth trillions. But up until that point, we're essentially looking at paying the bills through robotic development and sort of data.
Hi, yeah, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask you, what would you consider are the greatest logistical and technological challenges that your business faces in these next 10 years until you actually start mining the asteroids? And also related to that, are you expecting that any currently developing technologies will help you and your project?
No, I think the answer to both of them is the same. Yes, we are essentially dependent on the capabilities of launchers going up dramatically. So for example, every time that sort of Starship goes and does something cool, every time it sort of launches a couple of miles into space, or a couple of miles above the ground, that's another step closer towards the day where we can ultimately sort of mine asteroids. We are dependent on a very heavy lift capability to like deep space destinations. So realistically, we're sort of our hopes are pinned on SpaceX leading the way, but kind of we're also hoping that other providers, other launch providers, European providers, or whoever would also be able to sort of fill in that gap, because if there's only one launch provider who has that capability, then they set the price, and when there's a lack of competition, monopolies form, and yeah, that's not good for business. However, when there is sort of a plethora of providers, essentially we can find ourselves in a position where we get to choose, and that brings down cost for us, but also sort of spurs development in the space resources industry, sort of or the space industry as a wider entity on a much sort of deeper basis. So it's helpful for us to have a sort of keep an eye on future trends and developments, because obviously we're not going to get to an asteroid before what, 2027, 28, 29. So we're almost a decade away from being at an asteroid, even sort of at current projections. If things were to change, then we could possibly speed that up a little bit, but even then it would still be what, 6-7 years before we get there. So 6-7 years of sort of launcher development, we might find ourselves in a position where sort of more launchers are becoming online, and I imagine Starship would probably be the one that we're sort of looking at, because it's the biggest, it's the heaviest, but there may be others. And I think the reusability aspect of Starship is something which is particularly interesting, because obviously if you can use it sort of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, essentially that brings the cost per mission down dramatically as well, which ultimately is the main goal of commercial entity.
Thank you. We'll have about 2-3 more questions. Okay.
Hi, yeah, there's just a couple of things I wanted to ask you. So you mentioned a couple of times about the kind of property or priority rights to mining. And I'd kind of like to know how exactly that works, and kind of what's to stop a mad, unregulated rush between a few players kind of creating monopoly on all these resources, and then the rest of the world never gets a chance to enter this market at all. And secondly, you mentioned about the fact that this is kind of a more environmentally friendly way of resource extraction. I would maybe take issue with that slightly, in the sense that these, launching rockets into space has environmental consequences, setting aside the land for launch, and kind of dispersing pollutants and all that kind of thing. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so if I can take your first question first, and I'll come back to the second one in a minute. Essentially, the thing which is preventing sort of a mad rush is the licensing system. You can't send anything into space without a hell of a lot of paperwork. Even to launch a very small, quite basic satellite usually takes about 2 years worth of paperwork. The filings to get an orbital license are extensive and very expensive and time consuming to do. So if you were to, turn around and be very unreasonable and sort of say, we're going to claim this asteroid and that asteroid, and we're going to set up the empire of the sun or something weird like that, the government's not going to let you. Obviously, there's kind of ways around that. But under the Outer Space Treaty, you're essentially limited to the launching state and the licensing state, and both do have essentially have to have an oversight into your operations. So you have to sort of provide reports, provide statements on what you're doing. It has to be monitored. It's not us huddled away in a bunker, kind of hiding and saying, oh yeah, we're just going to take over the solar system. There's a massive amount of regulatory oversight which prevents us from doing anything near like that. And as part of that, essentially, we have to outline what we were doing long before we get anywhere near doing it. It's very much kind of developing the plans several years in advance of doing them, and then actioning them sort of as we are allowed to. To go to your sort of a secondary point to that first question, I feel very strongly about that, and that I think that it's, as the space resources industry, is sort of Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty essentially says that space should be used to the benefit of all humankind, and Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty essentially says that sort of there should be no celestial appropriation by nation states. We are kind of essentially honour and obligated, duty bound and obligated to ensure that the whole world benefits from space resources, and I take that very seriously. I think it's something which our industry should make front and centre, and as part of that, we are looking at essentially developing benefit sharing mechanisms whereby a proportion of our profits from mines or from sort of mining profits would essentially go towards a global development fund. So things like, an example would be Mauritius having a satellite in order to tackle sea level rises. That could be funded using kind of essentially a benefit sharing mechanism. We don't want to say the word tax because people get nervous about that, but essentially some kind of sort of mechanism where financial and technical benefits can go from spacefaring nations to non-spacefaring nations in order to essentially do some capacity building is very much part of our long-term vision for the space resources industry. To go towards the environmental aspect, you're obviously completely correct. Having a rocket launch does have an environmental impact. There are things like water propulsion from companies like Arca, which is sort of working in that, when sort of it remains to be seen whether or not that will work in the longer term. But yeah, and there is an environmental impact from rocket launches, but I think the raison d'etre, the main point of space resources is to establish infrastructure in space. So that's not just, sending up a drilling rig and sending up, processing equipment sort of on an asteroid. That's also building up the orbital infrastructure around Earth. So when we do have like large quantities of things like, nickel and iron, then that's the ingredients of steel. If you can have steel, you can have structures. If you can have structures, then you can build infrastructure. So I think the long-term vision of the asteroid mining industry and the space resources industry is essentially to build an infrastructure which is independent of Earth. It's to build an infrastructure which will not have any impact on our planet and will take place essentially completely independent from our planet without any environmental impact at all. And that will, in the longer term, require things like sort of orbital construction and space manufacturing. And there is sort of a growing trend towards that from other companies as well. So we think that sort of that is the future of the industry.
All right, thank you so much. We'll have one last very short question, and we'll call it a day.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I just had a couple questions about the technical feasibility of this. So I'm assuming that you're planning on processing the material on the asteroid itself for down mass efficiency. So one question is, how are you planning on getting the energy requirements there? Because refining metals is highly energy intensive. And secondly, down massing. So most deep space programs are planning on using in-space, in-situ resource utilization. So Starship, for example, is using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water ice on Mars. How are you planning on getting around that? Because you can't really do that in deep space. There's not really enough solar radiation. I doubt private companies can get permission for radioisotope. And if you go for hyperbolic fuels, then they don't have enough specific impulse to get you back.
So the answer to that is probably multi-pronged. First and foremost, it probably won't be a purely commercial entity. So as part of sort of establishing a kind of an infrastructure on an asteroid, you will probably be inviting space agency partners to get involved. And as part of that, that may solve the kind of the first point about not being allowed access to sort of radiothermal isotopes, because if, for example, we're looking to expand into the US over the next sort of 2 or 3 years, if you were to have kind of ESA, NASA, JAXA on board, then you could potentially sort of leverage that in order to sort of generate a power supply. With regards to the kind of the size of these, or the orbits of these missions, because they're near Earth asteroid missions, predominantly we would be looking at solar power initially, but obviously when it comes to kind of, you're right, with the processing of these materials, then solar power can only do so much unless you're sort of willing to build a massive solar array around an asteroid, which, you know, it seems economically unsustainable. So it's a question I can't answer fully at the minute, but there are very smart people who will probably answer that question over the next few years, and it may be that sort of some kind of public-private partnership would be put in place. An example for that would be in the fact that I believe Vodafone or Nokia, I'm not sure which one, currently has a contract to put 4G on the moon, because essentially NASA will want 4G for the Artemis program in order to sort of to develop communications. There is ways and mechanisms for sort of those public-private partnerships, where kind of state-based actors and private commercial actors can get involved. And I think it's important to kind of look at sort of space resources as not just being a one company. Like, we're not the East India Company. We're not going to go and do this on our own and sort of essentially monopolize space. We would look to and actively encourage as many partners to join in as possible, because the more actors that get involved in the industry, the more development the industry can sort of witness, and it will be seen over sort of the next 5-10 years as it becomes more and more sustainable that there is sort of companies who currently don't think that they have anything to do with space resources getting involved as well. So for example, I spoke to a chemical production company in Cheshire who didn't think they had anything to do with space at all, but turns out that they could have one of the main ingredients that we'd require for a processing plant, for example. So there are definitely sort of, it's not going to be a kind of a one company program. It's space resources is a broad church, in the same way that 10 years ago, if I'd have told you that Vodafone would be putting 4G in the moon, you'd have probably laughed at me and said I was mad. So companies who you wouldn't expect to be getting involved will almost certainly get involved in the longer term. And I think that the nuclear aspect was probably the solution to that, but I can't answer fully how that will work at the minute.
All right, so thank you, Mitch, so much for coming, and thank you for hosting this talk. Thanks everyone for your amazing questions. I hope you enjoyed the event, and yeah, we look to see you in our future events. And again, thanks, Mitch, for coming.
Thank you very much.
This will be posted
Cheers.
on our YouTube channel.
Brilliant.